Dear friends, welcome back. It's Sunday, so happy Sunday, and a new episode of Inside the Story Mailbox. Once again, so many of you have written to me. I had to make a small selection because if I had to read all your emails, well, it would take at least 3 hours of video. And honestly, who would watch that? A 3-hour video where I read your letters. Maybe only the people who actually sent them would watch it. But please be patient. You know how it is. Sometimes I skip some emails just because maybe you've already asked something that's been posted online, or you've asked questions I've already answered before. I can't always repeat the same things, so I tried to select a few things. First of all, I have to apologize to the few people who wrote to me about the meeting in Bologna. Unfortunately, I had to postpone it to another date because only 2 of you replied. Only 2 of you were available. It's a bit difficult for me to organize a public meeting because it means booking a room, the costs, and everything else. We'll try to do it again later on. Still in Bologna, however, the dinner for the day after tomorrow evening in Turin is confirmed. The followers who wrote to me will receive it soon. The investigations. Information on where we will hold the dinner, approximately around 8 p.m., the day after tomorrow, Tuesday. I know it's the last day of Carnival, but it's the only time, it's the only date when I have a free evening. So please be patient. Sometimes I also have to reconcile my schedule, which is quite full of commitments with other needs. But let's get back to your mail. So Gianandrea Ferrari wrote to me. He writes, "Good morning, Federico. Recently, I read an article about Langegeorg. This Austro-Hungarian naval cannon was meant for a battleship, but after the ship's construction was canceled, the completed cannon was mounted on a railway carriage instead. And it was the cannon that in 1916, from near Calsaranica al Albo, in the province of Trento, bombarded Asiago, in the province of Vicenza. In the article, they also wrote that, of course, the armament was replaced instead of the armor-piercing naval shells. This artillery is high-powered, and after every 100 shots, the barrel had to be sent back to the Skoda factory to be restored. What I haven't been able to understand, though, is whether this wear was caused by the change in ammunition, or if it was just typical of that kind of weapon. In short, the battleships of that time had to change their cannons every 100 shots. If that was the case, it seems to me that it was a rather inefficient type of weapon. Thank you. Keep it up," and so on. So, dear Gianandrea, the weapon you're referring to is the 350 mm cannon produced by Skoda around 1914. The code name was Skoda 35 CMK-14. A rather powerful weapon, it must be said, for the time, and moreover, it was selected as a weapon after many studies. Because initially the Austro-Hungarians had also considered other artillery, like the German ones, to try, for example, to simply standardize the ammunition. But they found the 350 caliber extremely convenient for various reasons. So regarding the weapon you mentioned, it was made for the battleships of the class. Herzog Monarch. Herzog in German means replacement. The Austro-Hungarian Navy, the Imperial Austro-Hungarian Naval Law, already had Monarch-class ships, but they were old coastal pre-dreadnought battleships, meaning they had multiple calibers and they were supposed to be retired from service. To replace them, it was planned to build 4 single-caliber super-dreadnought battleships with artillery of a caliber greater than the classic 305 mmers. And the design of these ships would have resembled what would later be the reconstruction of the Italian Doria and Conte di Cavour classes. So, 2 triple turrets, and above them, both at the stern and at the bow, 2 super-firing twin turrets. In the end, the matter of these battleships, as we know, ended up in a drawer. Simply put, during the First World War, the Austro-Hungarian war industry, but also the Italian one, think of the Caracciolo class, shifted towards other efforts, both in terms of manpower and raw materials. The cannons that were produced were used as land artillery, in the case you mentioned as railway guns, and in other cases, not far from my home, in Gorgo al Monticano, as land-based cannons. The problem with these weapons, or rather, there were essentially two problems. The first was the recoil, because these were very powerful weapons designed to be mounted in artillery turrets, with systems to manage the recoil, so with shock absorbers. For example, the case of the cannon at Gorgo al Montecano. It is known that it fired just 2 shots. After the second shot, it literally destroyed the ground carriage it was mounted on, and the weapon itself was damaged. The case you mentioned, that is, the cold replacement, does not involve the entire weapon. They didn't replace the entire cannon. They replaced the core of the cannon, the rifled core. The inside, because the wear and tear was not so much due to the ammunition itself, but rather to the strong stress caused by firing, led to deformations inside the rifled core of the weapon. So, after a certain number of shots, the Škoda required it every 120 shots. Other weapons, like those from Armstrong, Vickers, or Ansaldo, required a replacement every 150 to 180 shots. So you had to take care of it, which meant bringing the weapon to the naval workshop, where, when it was cold, the liner was removed and replaced with a new one. Nothing strange about that, right? Anyway, it's not like the cannon would break after 100 shots and needed to be completely replaced, maybe even melting down the old cannon. Absolutely, I can guarantee you that. Anyway, thank you, because you gave me the chance to talk about a topic that's rarely discussed, which is the little secrets of artillery. Let's move on to another friend of ours, Remigio Zanuso, who writes to us very often and has written me something very interesting. Why was France included among the winners of World War II, together with the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and the United States? I'm asking because, unlike the United Kingdom, Soviet Union, and United States, which were key in ending the war, France was conquered under the Vichy regime and even became a Nazi-aligned French state. It just seems that France did relatively little to win World War II, yet it is remembered as one of the 4 victors of Europe. It had control over part of West Germany after the war and participated in the Nuremberg trials. Other states, like Poland and Norway, fought hard against Germany and lost, yet they didn't receive the same status after the war. So am I missing something? The French were really determined in the fall of Nazi Germany, and I'm not aware of it. So, Remedio, first of all, thank you for writing to me again. You are always very kind. The question you raise is a political one. Let me explain. It's true, France signed the armistice at Compiègne in 1940. That's how it started. We addressed this in a specific video, the État Français, France, Vichy, and so on and so on and so on. But there's Charles de Gaulle, who, with his proclamation on the radio, on the British Broadcasting Corporation, with his activism in gathering troops, through his mission in Gabon and Cameroon, when these territories were part of the French colonial empire, with his accreditation first to the British government and then to the American one, and finally his ability after the Casablanca landing to obtain absolute political recognition as the new political and military leader of France, and with the possibility of re-enlisting part of the Vichy army into the Free French forces. So all this allowed France, not Vichy France, but Free France, de Gaulle's France, to establish itself as a victorious power. Why not Norway? Why not Poland or other states? Norway suffered a very harsh occupation, and despite the excellent role played by its resistance, it did not have an active role in the liberation not only of its own country, but also of other countries, as happened, for example, with the Free French forces, who fought not only in France but also in North Africa, in Italy, and obviously later in Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany. Poland had a problem. The fact that it too was essentially divided into 2 opposing governments, both in exile, each controlling a partisan army, the Armia Krajowa and the Armia Ludowa. And at the end of the war, Poland gradually and then definitively became a Soviet puppet regime until the fall of the Iron Curtain. It clearly couldn't be brought to the winner's table. And then, moreover, in the United Nations Security Council, with a permanent seat and the right of veto, a government perhaps not recognized like the one that led the Armia Krajowa, and yet a puppet government like the one that led the Armia Ludova. And that's the reason. France basically owes everything to de Gaulle. He was the architect of an epochal change, even in perception, to the point that France was considered a victorious power, even though we know very well that without British help at first, and then above all, American help, including material support. Think about the soldiers' uniforms, the weapons. Most of the armaments were of American origin. Free France would not even have been recognized as a fighting force. Just imagine, that's all there is to it. This combination of factors allowed France to establish itself in a different, positive way, so that it was later considered a victorious power, a power worthy of a permanent seat at the United Nations with veto power. And then later on, also to carry out research programs until it obtained a nuclear arsenal, one of the few internationally recognized. All of this is part of a path that began with that proclamation by de Gaulle on the British Broadcasting Corporation and then developed over time, as if you want to pinpoint a moment. The pivotal moment in history is de Gaulle's march on the Champs-Élysées. After the liberation of Paris in August 1944, the moment when de Gaulle essentially declares himself the strongman of France is acclaimed by the French people. And even the Allies are forced to recognize him as having an active role, including in politics. After what he had already done in Casablanca and Algiers during the negotiations with the Vichy French, I hope I have given you a precise answer. Then I received an email that was a bit different from usual, from someone who signed as Chris. He has his own email, but of course I can't share it. And he writes to me, "Hi Federico, a topic that has intrigued me for decades has come up. Now that I haven't lived in Italy for years, it concerns the television habits of Italians. Some of my memories are associated with boomers. Maybe I'm a bit of a boomer myself, but it's something that hasn't faded even today. Below, I've written an essay. Do with it what you want. Some time ago, I suggested a feature on the battleship Potemkin. Thanks to me, guys, you can find the video about Potemkin on the channel. The research that Chris did, I have to say, is very interesting. Because as the news says, first of all, it's a ritual to inform without informing, to explain without explaining, to connect without connecting. Actually, it's true. The news is like an IKEA piece of furniture, in the sense that it's something that fits anywhere, that easily finds its place. It doesn't need any special frills. It's a recurring habit, like going to IKEA, going to buy furniture. We turn on the television and look for a news program. Then there's also the tone itself, not just the voice, but the imprint of the journalist on the broadcast. Let's consider Ruggero Orlando from New York, as Chris uses as an example. Or the live broadcast from outside when the news itself, so to speak, gets some air, meaning the journalist connects right in the middle of the event or outside the television studio. By being present at the scene, he confirms that what he is telling you is actually feasible, true, something that really happened. Then propaganda, Chris calls it the Minzo Parade, refers to the time when Augusto Minzolini was the director of TG1, the main news program on Rai 1, the flagship channel of Rai, when there was also a bit of choreography involved. Then the post-Berlusconi period, when the Cavalier fell. The news program basically doesn't change. Maybe the posture of the anchorman or anchorwoman changes a bit. There's less enthusiasm, less fervor, but the structure remains the same. Then the comparison, which is perhaps the part I like most between TD1, the flagship news program, and the British Broadcasting Corporation TG1, writes Chris, and this is something you need to keep in mind. It starts with the reactions, because the facts alone are timid. So it's much better to stir emotions, to provoke something in the listener, instead of just reporting the bare reality. The British Broadcasting Corporation, on the other hand, what does it do? It starts by explaining what is happening, because it assumes that the viewer has a critical sense and doesn't need to have their emotions stirred, but can think for themselves. So the British Broadcasting Corporation explains and then discusses. Italian news programs discuss in order to avoid explaining. And this could also explain, excuse the pun, the fact that in the last 25 years there has been an explosion of talk shows, which are now everywhere, taking up prime time on most national television channels. Generalist, sometimes with very, very empty chatter. I have to say that this email from Chris is something that makes me think. Maybe one day I'll make a video specifically about television journalism, but I want to read you the conclusion that Chris wrote. Get informed, but not too much. The Italian news doesn't tell you what to think. That would be too much effort. It teaches you something more useful that you don't need to understand. And so, while real decisions are made elsewhere, we know everything about crocheting with your feet. This is an exaggeration. Well, very little about what really matters. A model public service. Harmless, polite, perfectly useless. So, Chris, I have to say something. You know, I'm a journalist, so I'm a bit involved. I've also done newscasts in the past. We're talking about a period that goes back 7 years. 6 years ago, I basically finished with the first phase of the pandemic. I was locked in at home. I still remember it from March until the 1st of July 2020. I had turned a room in my house into a television studio, and I was producing newscasts. As much as possible, the news must be made to inform, to communicate something, to communicate a politician's intention, to report a news story, and, in the best case, to share something positive. It could be a scientific discovery, a medical breakthrough, a sports achievement, but a fact must be communicated, or simply a statement. You're right when you say that unfortunately many Italian news programs tend to sensationalize, to put gossip before content. They prefer packaging over substance so as not to scare the viewer, to better guide their choices, to prevent them from thinking. I don't know. I have to say that in my small way, I used to do a local online news program, so I certainly can't compare myself to the big national news programs. I always tried to bring news and nothing more, of course. Then I also happened to do interviews. But interviews are one thing, facts are another. Opinions, or the attempt to steer information according to a certain way of thinking or opinion, are something else entirely. That's something I've never done, and I don't like doing it. If anything, here I use this space to show how, through the study of history, and sometimes even the analysis of current events, one can develop a way of thinking, because it's clear that thinking should be the ultimate goal. You don't learn facts just for the sake of memorizing them, simply to recite by heart dates and facts like a famous poem. You have to understand there's little point in doing a memory exercise if you don't understand what you're saying. It's clear that the news, which since the 1950s has become an almost indispensable appointment for many Italians. It's a ritual, as they say, but it's also a moment when, above all, you should try to understand what you have in front of you. Initially, there was only one news program, the WWII News, then 2 television channels, so 2 news programs, and then little by little we had a proliferation. Today we have so many national news programs, I'm not talking about the local ones, that you can choose the editorial line. There are pro-government news programs, as we know, and there are news programs that are critical of the government majority. There are news programs that try, not always successfully, to be impartial and to deliver the news in a fairly straightforward way, so as not to be labeled as supporters of one side or another. There is even a pop news program, I don't need to tell you which one, that has always had a rather peculiar editorial line where they prefer to deliver the news in a certain way, simply to attract young people or to stimulate some particular appetite. Fine, those are editorial choices. I have to say that a service like the English-British Broadcasting Corporation hasn't been seen in Italy for ages. And we're talking about the prehistoric days of television, when poor Enzo Biaggi was running the WWII News, the news program that Enzo Biaggi left, slamming the door. When someone tried to force him to hire people based on party membership, the old system of political appointments. Enzo Biaggi was a serious journalist. He wanted to provide real information and not do favors, because that's what it's called when you do favors for the powerful politician of the moment. Today it's difficult to do that kind of work, not because it's impossible or there's no will, but because every time the journalist has to deal with a publisher who is the owner of the television network, or the main shareholder. That person ultimately sets the direction, whether you like it or not. And I realize that something that has continued over the years never changes, but becomes more and more evident, especially when maybe a television network changes its main shareholder. And then you also see changes within the news program, not only in the management, where the editor-in-chief is replaced, but especially in the editorial line they follow. I would really like to see concise, well-made news programs, where the events are put first and there's no room for empty chatter. I would like to see television where talk shows disappear for good, because we need to focus on reality, on what needs to be done, not on arguments between this or that or the other politician, with the presence maybe of some journalist who almost smiles seeing the sea they're about to dive into, a sea, obviously, of controversies and empty discussions. We would need more concreteness. We would also need that. And here I want to make a note about our own politics, the freedom to ask questions and the obligation for politicians to answer. We have lost this. We have lost it over time, and unfortunately, it is becoming an established habit. Let's hope we can go back one day. Anyway, thank you, Chris, for prompting through your message, your email, a deep reflection on something that is part of our history as well as our daily life. Television, and specifically information through television. I'll stop here for today, and I wish you all a good Sunday. I remind you that to write to the Dentro La Storia mailbox, you need to send an email to F. Bettuzzi, a Dentro La Storia, net, specifying DL's mail in the subject of the email, simply because that way it's easier for me to select and sort through the emails that come in. I'll see you in the next videos. Who wrote to me about the dinner in Turin? See you in a couple of days. Tuesday the 17th around 8 p.m. I will send the address and the exact time to those who wrote to me, and talk to you soon with new content, always here in Dentro La Storia.